Lord, take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen. Whenever I read the gospel story that we had today about Jesus walking across the water to his disciples, I think back on a story that an older woman I know loves to tell. It's a story about something that happened with the groundskeeper at her lake home. She lived on the lake, and the person that kept the grounds walked around a lot, even when he wasn't working, and kind of just watched things going on, and every now and then they'd have a conversation. So one day, they were down near the lakeside, and the groundskeeper looked at, I'll call her Mrs. Jones, because if she's watching, I don't like her to think, maybe somebody else told this story. So the groundskeeper looked at her and said, Mrs. Jones, you know, if I had enough faith, I could walk across that water. And Mrs. Jones thought that was pretty funny, and so she laughed and she said, well, I don't want to see you do it. She thought it was funny, but she missed the point. She missed the point. Because the groundskeeper, like everybody else that worked at that house, and like the people that lived in the house, knew that she was in an abusive marriage. And they had heard, I'm sure, arguments, shouting, some of the violence that took place. And they had quietly not said anything about it. But most people thought she needed to get out, but she was too afraid to get out. So that day, the groundskeeper wasn't being silly. He wasn't being ridiculous, thinking that he could literally walk across the water if he had enough faith. He was trying to encourage her. He was using a biblical metaphor. He didn't even intend it literally. He was using a biblical metaphor to say, you know, if you have enough faith in Jesus, you can move on. You can walk across the storm that your life is now. I think when we read this passage, we often make the same mistake that the woman did. We get so caught up in whether it literally happened or not, that we spend all of our time arguing the point, whichever side we're on. If we think it couldn't have literally happened, then that's what we want to convince somebody of. And if we think it had to have literally happened, that's what we want to convince somebody of. And we can get so tied up in that, like the woman, we miss the point of the story. And the point of the story is about what was happening with Peter. The point of the story was that over the waters that were wild and chaotic, and the storm that was raging, when Peter kept his eyes on Jesus, he was okay. And when he stopped keeping his eyes on Jesus, he began to sink. And that's the point, not just for Peter, but for us. That's the point we're supposed to get, is that when we keep our eyes on Jesus, no matter what storms are going on in our lives, no matter how much the security of what boat we think we've created for ourselves is, that if we keep our eyes on Jesus, we can make it through, and we'll be okay, and we can even walk across the waters that we think we couldn't possibly walk across, and move on in ways that we don't even think we could possibly move on. When we begin to see that and get off the dime of just arguing about whether it literally happened or not, it changes our question. It changes our question. It changes our question from, well, how could that happen? Or did it happen? To what does it mean for me to keep my eyes on Jesus? And that's a more important question to deal with. What does it mean for me to keep my eyes on Jesus? And if we're going to look at that question, we've got to look back at the Gospels. Because it's in the 4 Gospels that we see Jesus living life. And if we're going to keep our eyes on Jesus, we've kind of got to know how he went about living life. Now, when I look at the Gospels, we could talk about a lot of different things the Gospels show us about how Jesus lived life. But 2 particularly came to mind to me in considering this story and in considering what it means for me personally to keep my eyes on Jesus when the storm is battering the boat that I'm in. One of the things I notice when I look in the Gospels at Jesus is that he is not problem-free. In fact, he has one problem after another. He tries to teach his disciples what he wants them to do, and they always miss the point. He is mocked and jeered by most people. Sometimes they even throw rocks at him. At one point in time, even his mothers and his brothers try to talk him out of doing what he's doing because they think he's really making a fool of himself. He's always got both the religious authorities and the political authorities after him. There's at least one time in the Gospels where we know he wonders if God has abandoned him altogether. And quite often we find him weeping or at least lamenting the brokenness of this world in which he's living. What we don't see is we don't see him surprised by having problems. He doesn't seem to think that his life, since he is the Messiah, should be problem-free. And he doesn't beat himself up or put himself in a pit of guilt because he didn't see that problem coming and didn't do something to keep it from happening before it got there. What we do see is every time a problem comes up, he simply deals with the problem and moves on. What we see in the Gospels is a Jesus who realizes that problems are just the stuff of life. And it's his willingness to live into the stuff of life, problems and all, that allows him to walk on water. So that's one thing I think it says to us. It says to us something about how do we treat the problems in our lives. Do we treat them as if they shouldn't be there and get all upset because they're there and blame ourselves for not being able to keep them from happening? Or do we simply say, this is the stuff of life? And like Jesus, I'll keep my eyes on Jesus and I'll live the stuff of life, problems and all. The second thing I see when I look at the Gospels is Jesus' whole idea of what is success and failure seems to be completely different from mine. I mean, he tends to say that success is being willing to be last instead of fighting to be first. And he says things like, it's better that you've got a lot of money and possessions and holding on to those or just taking over your life. It would be better just to give them all away than to let your life be enslaved to holding on to what you've got. Now, that's not what we see in the world. I mean, we see that success is fight to be first, no matter what. And we see that working 365 days a year, 24/7 is, what we're supposed to do. That's success. In fact, we would look at somebody who did less as a slacker, a loser. And we certainly wouldn't think, as Jesus seems to paint success as, that success might look like getting out of the safety of our boat and jumping into the water. We would tend to say it's better to stay in the safety of the boat. So when I look at Jesus and keeping my eyes on Jesus, what it tells me is that I've got to radically change my understanding of what looks like success and failure in my life. Well, that's a hard thing to do. And so if keeping my eyes on Jesus means that I've got to radically change, it would be a whole lot easier just to argue over whether I can literally walk on water or not. That's a much easier thing to do than to hear the point of the story and realize that to keep our eyes on Jesus requires some radical change. But I think the old groundskeeper was right. I think that if we have enough faith in Jesus, and in this case, I think that means if we have enough trust in the fact that Jesus really did know what he was doing when he dealt with problems and success and failure differently from us, that it wasn't just some fluke, that he actually knew something wise about that. We have enough trust in that. Then we too can walk on water when we really need to.